Hi everyone! In the last video we saw how to evaluate exponential functions by using our calculator, and we remembered how to evaluate exponential functions when we were evaluating at an integer, that is when we were raising something to an integer power. So in this video I want to show you some tricks for evaluating exponential functions without your calculator in some special cases. So let's say our exponential function is f of x equals 4 to the x. So 4 is our base. We're going to be plugging in values for x. If I want to do f of 1/2, then I plug in 1/2 for x, so I'm doing 4 to the 1/2. But remember that raising something to the 1/2 power is like taking the square root. So this is just the square root of 4, which is 2. So the rule that we used there is just that something to the 1/2 power equals the square root of that thing. Or more generally, something to the 1 over n power is the nth root of that thing. So now let's say that I'm evaluating at -1/2. So x is -1/2 now. So I have to do 4 to the -1/2. I could write this as 4 to the -1 to the 1/2. The rule that I'm using there is that a to the m raised to the n is just a to the m times n. And 4 to the -1, this is 1 over 4 raised to the 1/2. And that will give us 1 to the 1/2 over 4 to the 1/2, or square root 1 over square root 4. That's just a half. So I'm using the rules of exponents to simplify this expression, which I'm supposed to evaluate. We'll do another. F of 3/2 is going to be 4 to the 3 over 2. And I can use this same rule again to write this as 4 to the 1/2 and the whole thing raised to the 3. So just using the fact that 3 times a half is 3 over 2. And 4 to the 1/2 we already know is 2. So I'm just doing 2 to the 3, and that's 8. So when you have rational values to plug in for x, when we're evaluating for rational numbers, we can often just use these tricks to evaluate it. Let's do another set of examples. So here I have f of x equals 1/4 to the x. So one interesting thing you could note here is that 1 over 4 is just the same as 4 to the -1. So my base is 4 to the -1, then I'm raising it to the x. So this is the same function as 4 to the -x. That's a big key here. So when I do f of 2, I could do it in two ways. I could do 1 over 4 raised to the 2, which is going to be 1 to the 2 over 4 to the 2, which is 1 over 16. Or I could do 4 to the -2 by plugging into this function. And that's the same as 1 over 4 to the 2 from our rules of exponents, which is 1 over 16. We get the same thing. To do f of 1/2 now, I could do 1 over 4 to the 1/2. So that would be square root 1 over square root 4, which gives us a half. Or I could do 4 to the -1/2. And we actually did that in our last example, 4 to the -1/2, which gave us a half. And finally, f of -1/2 is going to be 1 over 4 to the -1/2. But it's actually easier to think of it like this by writing 4 to the -1 raised to the -1/2, because that gives me 4 to the 1/2 when I multiply those exponents together, and that's just 2. So what I did here is just thought of it as 4 to the -1/2. So if you're ever asked to evaluate without your calculator, the trick is going to just be using some collection of these exponent rules. Maybe noticing that a fraction is the same as having a negative exponent, or maybe separating a fraction like 3/2 into the parts 1/2 and 3. So come back to this video and look over these examples if you have any more questions. And in the next video, we'll move on to graphing these special functions.